The forest was quiet, except for the faint sound of a distant bird singing its morning song. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft golden hue over the trees and the ground below. The air was cool, filled with the earthy smell of wet leaves and damp soil. In this peaceful, remote part of the world, no one would have expected anything extraordinary to happen. It was just another ordinary morning in a place where nature reigned, and humans rarely ventured. But something was wrong. Something had happened the night before, something that disrupted the peaceful rhythm of the forest. A bright flash in the sky had lit up the darkness, followed by a loud crash that shook the ground. No one had seen it, but the evidence was there, lying in the middle of the woods. A small, damaged spacecraft sat motionless in a clearing, its sleek metallic surface dented and scorched from the impact. Smoke still rose from one of the engines, but it was clear that the ship wasn't going anywhere. There were no signs of life coming from it, just the eerie silence that seemed to hang in the air. Whoever had been inside the craft was no longer in a position to call for help. If help was even coming, inside the ship, amidst the wreckage, lay a young alien girl. Her delicate frame was unconscious, her bioluminescent skin dimmed from the shock of the crash. Her clothes, once a pristine white, were torn and dirty, stained with blood from the injuries she had sustained during the fall. Her long, flowing hair, shimmering in soft shades of silver and blue, lay tangled on the cold metal floor. The girl's large eyes, so full of life before, were now closed, leaving her face pale and still. The crash had been sudden and violent. There had been no warning, no time to prepare. She had been thrown into the chaos of a violent battle far from home, with no way to defend herself. Her people had fled a war that raged across the stars, but the forces chasing them were relentless. In her attempt to escape, she had crash-landed on a strange planet, Earth. Now Earth's authorities were about to find her, but whether they would care for her or treat her as just another casualty of a war beyond their understanding was uncertain. The girl had never intended to come here. She had never even heard of this planet before. Yet here she was, stranded and abandoned by those who had once promised to protect her. As the hours passed, the girl remained unconscious, her breathing shallow and slow. She was unaware of the approaching footsteps that were closing in on her. First, a few curious locals had stumbled upon the wreckage, but they hadn't been able to make sense of what had happened. The ship's appearance was unlike anything they had ever seen, and the girl's strange features only made the situation more confusing. Soon, local authorities arrived. They were trained to deal with disasters, but nothing in their training had prepared them for something like this. They didn't know what to make of the ship or its occupant. The girl, lying helpless and still in the wreckage, was an alien. To them, she was an enigma, something foreign and possibly dangerous. They didn't know how to help her, so they did what they always did in situations like this. They called for backup. The government sent soldiers and scientists to assess the situation. A team of doctors was sent to check the girl's vital signs, but they weren't sure how to treat her. Her injuries didn't make sense. Her anatomy was completely different from anything they had ever studied. Her blood was of an unknown composition, her body temperature too low to be human, yet she appeared to be alive. And yet, despite all their questions, no one seemed to be in a hurry to save her. The soldiers stood in a loose circle around the wreckage, unsure of what to do next. Some were eager to claim the discovery as a triumph for humanity, proof that there was life beyond Earth. Others were nervous, fearing the potential danger that this alien could pose. The scientists argued among themselves, debating what they should do with the girl. Some wanted to take her into a laboratory for research, while others suggested keeping her isolated until they could better understand her. But no one wanted to be the one to act first, to make the decision to help her. As the discussion grew louder, the girl remained unconscious. She could hear the voices faintly, but they were distant and muffled, like whispers in a dream. She couldn't make out their words, but she could feel their coldness. They didn't care about her. She wasn't one of them. To them, she was just another object to study, another thing to control. It was then that a man appeared in the clearing. Jason was a mechanic, the kind of person who spent most of his days fixing broken machines in a small town on the edge of the forest. He had heard the crash the night before, but hadn't thought much of it. After all, there were always strange things happening in the woods, people getting lost, wild animals, even the occasional car accident. But when he saw the smoke in the distance and followed the trail to the wreckage, he knew something was different. He didn't expect to find an alien girl lying in the wreckage, her body broken and bruised. He didn't expect to find a being from another world, completely alone and in need of help. But that's what he saw. The moment he laid eyes on her, Jason knew he had to act. The authorities were standing around, debating what to do. Jason couldn't stand the thought of them letting her die while they argued. He didn't care about their orders or their fears. All he saw was a young girl who needed help. Without a second thought, he knelt beside her and gently touched her arm. The girl flinched slightly, but she didn't wake. Jason took a deep breath, careful not to disturb her further. He wasn't a doctor, but he knew how to fix things. He had repaired machines, tools, and vehicles his whole life. Fixing a person wasn't much different, was it? He lifted her carefully from the wreckage, cradling her in his arms. The girl was lighter than he had expected, her fragile body barely a burden. He carried her away from the wreck, towards the small cabin he called home. The soldiers didn't stop him. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know if they should stop him or let him take the girl. The scientists didn't even look up. Jason didn't wait for permission, he just acted. And that was enough. The girl was limp in his arms, her breathing still shallow, but she was alive. Jason made his way through the forest, navigating the winding trails he knew so well. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let her die. By the time Jason reached his cabin, the sun had fully risen. He carefully placed the girl on his bed, tucking her in with an old, worn blanket. He didn't know how to treat her injuries, but he could at least make sure she was comfortable. He cleaned the blood from her skin as best as he could, wrapping her wounds in clean cloth. As the day wore on, Jason watched over her, unsure of what the future held. He knew the authorities would be searching for her. He knew they would eventually come looking for the alien girl. But for now, she was safe. For now, she was with him. And that, he thought, was enough. Jason sat in the small chair beside the bed, his eyes never leaving the alien girl. He could hear the faint sound of her breathing, shallow and steady, but still fragile. Her strange, bioluminescent skin had regained some of its glow, but she still looked pale, like a delicate flower that had been knocked loose from its stem. Her long, silvery blue hair lay tangled on the pillow, shimmering softly in the light that filtered through the cabin's windows. For the last few hours, Jason had been sitting there, watching her carefully. He wasn't sure how long it would take for her to wake up or if she would even survive. Her injuries had been serious. The crash had been a brutal one, and he wasn't a doctor. He was just a mechanic, someone who fixed things, but he couldn't just leave her. He had made a promise to himself that he would do whatever it took to keep her safe, to protect her from whatever forces were closing in on her. He glanced at the window, seeing the sunlight beginning to fade. The world outside was quiet for now, but Jason knew that it wouldn't stay quiet forever. He had no doubt that someone or something would come looking for her. The authorities, the military, maybe even more alien ships. He didn't know who or what, but he was sure they would come. But for now, in this cabin, there was peace. He had created a bubble of safety around them. Jason stood and moved quietly to the small stove in the corner of the room. The alien girl didn't react, and for that he was grateful. He didn't know how much she could hear or understand, but he didn't want to disturb her. She had been through so much already. He prepared a small meal, nothing fancy, just some bread and water. He set the food aside, knowing he couldn't force her to eat just yet. She needed time to recover, but at least he could offer her some comfort in the meantime. When he turned back to the bed, he saw that her eyes were open, though only partially. Her large, dark eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and Jason could see the confusion in them as she looked around the room, taking in her unfamiliar surroundings. She blinked a few times as if she couldn't quite make sense of what was happening. Her gaze eventually landed on him, and for a brief moment their eyes met. "Are you okay?" Jason asked softly, his voice hesitant. The alien girl didn't answer at first. She simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. She looked so lost, so helpless. Jason's heart ached for her, but he remained still, not wanting to overwhelm her. She had been through something unimaginable, and it would take time for her to trust him, to trust anyone again. After a long moment, the girl finally moved her lips, her voice weak and hoarse. It took Jason by surprise. "Where am I?" Her voice was soft, almost like a whisper. Jason knelt beside the bed, careful not to startle her. "You're safe," he said gently. "You're in my cabin. It's far from the city, out in the forest." She seemed to process his words slowly, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Safe," she repeated as if the concept was foreign to her. You are human? Jason nodded. Yes, I'm human. My name's Jason. He gave her a small, reassuring smile, though he wasn't sure if she understood the gesture. And you're not from here, are you? The girl's eyes widened slightly, and she seemed to recoil a little as if the question had struck a chord. Jason instantly regretted asking it. She was an alien, after all. He didn't know what kind of memories or experiences she carried with her, or if she even wanted to think about it. I don't remember, she replied quietly, her voice trembling as she looked down at her hands. She blinked away a few tears, but they didn't fall. Jason wasn't sure if it was because she couldn't cry or if she was simply too exhausted to do so. I don't remember how I got here. Jason's heart sank. You were in a crash. Your ship, it didn't make it. He hesitated, unsure how much to say. But you're safe now. No one's going to hurt you. The girl's eyes flickered to the window as if she were listening for something. Jason followed her gaze but saw nothing. There was only the quiet rustle of the wind outside. Still, the tension in the room was palpable, and he could feel his nerves on edge. She turned back to him, her expression softening slightly. I don't want to hurt anyone, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to understand what happened. Jason nodded, though he wasn't sure how much he could explain to her. How could he? The girl didn't even understand where she was, much less what kind of world she had landed in. The authorities, the military, they would come looking for her sooner or later. They would see her as a threat, something dangerous, something that needed to be contained. Jason didn't want that to happen, but he had no idea how long he could keep her hidden. I don't know how much I can help you with that, Jason admitted, his voice low, but I'll keep you safe as long as I can, I promise you that. For the first time, the girl gave him a faint, uncertain smile. Thank you, she whispered, and for a moment the weight of everything seemed to lift just a little. But the relief was short-lived. The sound of engines broke through the silence outside. Jason's heart skipped a beat. The noise grew louder, the distinct hum of military vehicles approaching. He stood up quickly, panic rising in his chest. He didn't know how they'd found them, but it didn't matter. They were here, and they would stop at nothing to find the girl. The girl's eyes widened in alarm as she heard the engines too. She struggled to sit up, her body still weak from the crash. Jason rushed to her side, helping her back down onto the bed gently. Stay here, he said urgently. Don't move. The girl nodded, her wide eyes fixed on him, full of uncertainty. Jason quickly moved to the window, peeking through the curtains. A convoy of trucks was making its way toward the cabin, their headlights cutting through the darkening forest. He could see soldiers, armed, determined, climbing out of the vehicles. They weren't here for peace. They were here for her, for the alien girl, and they wouldn't stop until they had her. Jason didn't have time to think. He had to act fast. Without another word, he rushed to the door and locked it. He moved swiftly to the back of the cabin, where he had a small stash of supplies. His mind raced as he grabbed what he could: a few tools, a map of the forest, and a heavy coat. The cold night air would be a problem, but he had no choice. He had to get the girl out of here. Jason turned back to her, his heart pounding in his chest. We need to go, he said urgently. I'll take you somewhere safe. You can't stay here. The girl looked terrified, but she nodded without hesitation. She trusted him. Jason didn't know if it was because she had no other choice or because she had seen something in him that made her believe he could protect her. Either way, she didn't argue. She was willing to go with him. Jason moved to her side, carefully helping her stand. She was shaky, but she managed to stay on her feet. Together, they made their way to the back door. Jason opened it slowly, making sure there was no one outside. The night was quiet again, but the sound of the engines was getting closer. They had no time to waste. The forest was still, and Jason's heart raced as he led the alien girl through the dense trees. He could hear the hum of the vehicles from the military convoy in the distance, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He had to keep moving, and so did she. The girl's steps were unsteady, but she managed to keep up with him, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. The wind blew gently through the branches above them, but it did nothing to ease the tension that gripped Jason's chest. Every step they took felt heavier than the last, and the weight of what they were doing pressed on him more than he cared to admit. He wasn't sure how much longer they could stay ahead of the soldiers. They were experienced, trained to track down anyone or anything they deemed a threat, and right now that threat was her. As they moved deeper into the forest, Jason's mind raced. He needed a plan, but the only thing he knew for certain was that they couldn't stay in one place for too long. The military would find them if they didn't keep moving. He glanced at the girl who was walking beside him, her pale face illuminated by the dim light filtering through the trees. She didn't speak. She didn't even look at him, but Jason knew she was scared. He could see it in her eyes. "Stay close," he said softly, glancing back at her. "I'll get us somewhere safe." The girl nodded, though Jason could tell she didn't fully understand what was happening. She didn't know this world. She didn't know Earth. All she knew was that she had crashed here far from home, and now she was running for her life. She had no one, and the only person who seemed to care about her was him. Jason didn't blame her for being frightened. If the roles were reversed, he would be terrified too. An alien in a foreign world, surrounded by strange people and even stranger creatures. He had no idea what kind of powers she had or what kind of abilities her species possessed, but he didn't care. All he knew was that she was alive, and he wasn't going to let anyone take her from him. The sound of the military convoy grew louder, and Jason's pulse quickened. He could hear the crunch of leaves and branches as the soldiers moved through the forest, searching for any sign of their target. He pushed forward, his feet moving faster, and the girl stumbled slightly, struggling to keep up. "Are you okay?" Jason asked, his voice gentle. The girl nodded, though her expression was still distant. She didn't seem to understand him completely, but she trusted him. That much was clear. She had no one else, and Jason wasn't about to let her down. They kept moving, their path winding through the trees. Jason had memorized the forest from his many walks, but tonight everything seemed different. The shadows were longer, the trees seemed closer, and the air felt heavier. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Jason tried to keep his thoughts focused, but they kept wandering. He thought about the girl, the alien girl, as he had come to think of her. She was so different from him, yet so similar. She had suffered a great loss, just as he had in his own life. He didn't know her story, didn't know where she had come from, but he could feel the pain she carried inside her. The fear, the confusion. Jason wished he could do more for her. He wished he could explain everything, the world, the people, the dangers, but he didn't know how. He wasn't a hero, he wasn't even trained to fight. All he had were his instincts, and right now, those instincts told him to protect her, to keep her safe. They stopped briefly by a small creek to rest. Jason crouched down beside the water, pulling out the small pack he had brought with them. He handed the girl a bottle of water, and she took it from him hesitantly. She didn't speak, but she drank slowly, her eyes scanning the forest around them. Jason couldn't help but wonder what she was thinking, what she was feeling. She was so different from anyone he had ever known, yet there was something about her that made him want to protect her. "Hey," Jason said after a moment, breaking the silence. "I don't know how long this is going to take, but we'll get through this, I promise." The girl looked at him, her eyes wide with curiosity. She didn't seem to understand his words, but she must have sensed the sincerity in his voice. For the first time since they had met, she gave him a faint smile, though it was brief. She had no reason to trust him, and yet she did. Jason didn't know how to explain it, but he could feel the bond between them growing, even if it was unspoken. Suddenly, the sound of distant voices reached their ears. Jason froze, his heart racing. The soldiers were getting closer. They couldn't stay here, not for long. "Come on," Jason whispered urgently, grabbing her hand and pulling her to her feet. "We've got to keep moving." The girl stumbled slightly, but Jason steadied her, keeping his grip firm as they hurried through the woods. He didn't know where they were headed, but he couldn't afford to stop. The convoy was only a few minutes behind them now, and Jason knew they were getting closer. They pushed through the thick underbrush, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth beneath them. Jason's mind was racing. Where could they go? What was the best route? He didn't have a plan. He didn't have anything other than his determination to keep the girl safe. As they continued running, Jason's thoughts turned to the girl's abilities. She had powers, that much was clear. The way she had healed herself after the crash, the strange glow of her skin, it was unlike anything Jason had ever seen. She wasn't just an alien. She was something else, something powerful. Jason didn't know if her powers were a gift or a curse, but he knew one thing for sure: he had to protect her. If the military found her, they would use her. They would experiment on her, study her, and probably end up destroying her. He couldn't let that happen, not to her. The forest seemed to close in around them as they ran. The trees grew thicker, the shadows deeper, and the sounds of the convoy faded into the distance. Jason slowed slightly, glancing over at the girl. She was breathing heavily, but she was still keeping pace with him. Her eyes were wide, her face pale, but she wasn't showing signs of giving up. She was strong, stronger than she knew. Finally, they reached a small clearing. It was the same clearing Jason had used before, the one he had used to hide from the world when he needed to think. It was a secluded spot, surrounded by thick trees on all sides. He knew it would be difficult for anyone to find them here, at least not without a lot of effort. It wasn't much, but it was all he had for now. Jason lowered the girl to the ground, sitting down beside her. "We need to rest," he said, his voice low and steady. "We'll keep moving again soon, but we need to catch our breath first." The girl didn't argue. She sat beside him, her body tense, her eyes darting around the clearing. Jason knew she was still on edge, still afraid. But there was a quiet strength in her, something he hadn't seen before. She was resilient. She had to be, or she wouldn't have survived the crash. "We're safe here," Jason said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. "For now." The girl nodded slowly, but her gaze never left the trees surrounding them. Jason could feel the weight of the silence between them, the fear of what was coming next. But for now, they were together, and that was enough. Jason's eyes flickered over the clearing, the shadows of the trees stretching long as the night deepened around them. The stillness was unsettling, the quiet of the forest broken only by the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. The girl sat beside him, her eyes darting around nervously, every sound amplified in her heightened state of alert. Jason could feel the tension in the air, thick with the knowledge that danger was never far behind. He glanced down at her. She was exhausted. Her silvery blue hair was tangled, her face pale under the dim light of the moon. But despite everything, despite the fear and the uncertainty, there was a quiet strength in her that Jason admired. She had already shown him how resilient she was, how determined she was to survive. He just wished there was more he could do for her. "We should move again soon," Jason said, his voice low. He didn't want to stay in one place too long, but he also knew they needed to rest. They couldn't keep running forever. The girl nodded slightly but didn't speak. Her eyes were fixed on the distant tree line, and Jason couldn't tell if she was looking for danger or simply lost in her thoughts. He had 1,000 questions he wanted to ask her, where she came from, who her people were, what her species was capable of. But he knew now wasn't the time for that. She was still trying to understand where she was, what was happening. She didn't need to carry the burden of explaining it all to him just yet. Jason took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs. It was strange how calm he felt despite the situation. They were being hunted, but at least he wasn't alone. They were in this together, and as long as he was there, he would do everything in his power to protect her. But even Jason knew that eventually they would run out of places to hide. The military wasn't the only threat. Whoever was behind the girl's crash would stop at nothing to find her, and Jason wasn't sure how much longer they could stay ahead of them. It wasn't just about staying alive anymore. It was about keeping the girl safe, no matter the cost. "We need to go deeper into the woods," Jason said after a pause, his voice barely above a whisper. "It'll be harder for them to track us if we stay off the main paths." The girl seemed to understand, or perhaps it was instinct that guided her to her feet without hesitation. Jason rose quickly, scanning the area once more before they started moving again. The path they followed was narrow, barely a trail at all, winding through the trees and thick underbrush. Every now and then, Jason could hear the distant sounds of the convoy, the hum of their engines unmistakable in the stillness of the night. They were getting closer, but for now, Jason was confident that they were hidden well enough. They walked for what felt like hours, the trees growing denser around them. Jason's legs were starting to ache, but he pushed through the pain, knowing they couldn't afford to stop. The alien girl was still walking beside him, her footsteps quiet but steady. Jason noticed that she was breathing easier now, her pace a little more confident. It was a small victory, but it was enough to give him hope. The moon was high in the sky when they came to a small, quiet stream. The sound of running water filled the air, soft and soothing. Jason stopped for a moment, the weight of their situation settling back on him. He had no idea where they were going, no idea what he was going to do once they ran out of places to hide. But for now, at least, they had a moment of peace. "We'll rest here for a while," Jason said, looking around at the peaceful surroundings. The stream seemed like a safe place to stop. The noise of the water would cover their footsteps, and it was far enough from the main paths that they wouldn't be found easily. The girl sat down beside the stream, her eyes watching the water flow by. She didn't speak, but Jason could see the weariness in her eyes. She was exhausted, but she didn't complain. She didn't ask for more than he could give her, and somehow that made him feel even more determined to protect her. She didn't owe him anything, but he had already promised to help her, and he intended to keep that promise. Jason sat beside her, his back resting against a tree. He didn't say anything, just watched the water flow, trying to calm his racing thoughts. His mind was spinning with the possibilities. What if they didn't make it? What if they were caught? The thought made his stomach turn, but he pushed it aside. There was no use thinking like that. They were still free, still moving, still alive. The alien girl looked over at him then, her eyes meeting his. There was something in her gaze, something so pure and full of quiet understanding. She didn't need to speak for him to know what she was feeling. She was scared, but she was also grateful. Grateful that someone had chosen to help her, someone who didn't see her as a threat, someone who saw her as a person. For a moment, Jason allowed himself to relax. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him the strength to keep going. They would get through this. He had to believe that. The sound of movement in the distance broke the silence, and Jason's body tensed. He immediately stood up, signaling to the girl to stay quiet. She nodded, her expression serious as she rose to her feet, ready to move again. Jason looked toward the trees, trying to discern where the noise was coming from. It wasn't the military, this was different. The footsteps were too light, too soft. The hair on the back of Jason's neck stood up as he realized they weren't alone. Someone, or something, was out there. He motioned for the girl to follow him, and they moved silently into the underbrush, keeping low to the ground. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he crouched down, peering through the leaves. He could see the faint outline of a figure moving through the trees. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything he had ever seen before. The creature was tall and slender, with skin that shimmered faintly in the moonlight. Its features were angular, its body long and wiry. Jason held his breath, watching it move closer, its eyes scanning the area. The girl beside him stiffened, her eyes wide with fear. Jason glanced at her quickly, signaling for her to stay silent. She didn't move, her gaze fixed on the creature. It was an alien, one that didn't look anything like the girl who had crashed on Earth. Jason didn't know if it was a friend or an enemy, but he knew one thing for sure: this creature wasn't here to help. It was part of the force that was after her. The alien moved closer, its movements fluid and precise. Jason couldn't make out its exact intentions, but he had no time to think. He motioned for the girl to stay low, and they began to back away slowly, careful not to make a sound. The last thing Jason wanted was for the creature to notice them. But as they retreated further into the shadows, the alien stopped. It tilted its head slightly, as if sensing something. Jason's heart skipped a beat. Had they been spotted? The creature turned toward them, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Jason held his breath, ready to run, but the alien didn't move. Instead, it looked back at the clearing and then slowly turned away, disappearing into the trees. Jason let out a quiet sigh of relief, but the tension in his chest didn't ease. They were being hunted. There was no doubt about that. And now, with more alien forces on their trail, Jason realized the stakes had only grown higher. He looked over at the girl, who was still watching the spot where the creature had vanished. Her face was pale, but her eyes were hard. She had seen the danger, and she knew the risks they were facing. They had to keep moving. There was no more hiding. "We need to go," Jason said quietly, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at him. The girl nodded, and together they disappeared into the shadows of the forest once again.